Regime Change Summary and Analysis. How Trump Transformed the American Presidency. Trump, Power, Loyalty, and the Making of an Imperial Presidency. Regime Change. Inside the Imperial Presidency of Donald Trump is a 2026 work of political nonfiction by New York Times White House correspondents Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan. Haberman has covered Trump for years and previously wrote Confidence Man. Swan has covered all three Trump presidential campaigns and became particularly well known for his 2020 interview with Trump. Together they approached regime change less as conventional political commentators than as reporters reconstructing conversations, decisions, and power struggles from inside the administration. The reporting was based on more than 1,000 interviews, according to multiple accounts of the book and the author's promotional interviews. That matters because Regime Change is not primarily a theoretical book about constitutional law or presidential history. Its evidence comes from rooms, Oval Office conversations, Situation Room meetings, personnel fights, cabinet deliberations, telephone calls, arguments among advisors, discussions over immigration, tariffs, Iran, Ukraine, Elon Musk, Jeffrey Epstein, and the sprawling machinery of the federal government. The tailored book summary framework calls for political and argument-led nonfiction to be reconstructed through its thesis, evidence, counterclaims, contradictions, weaknesses, and practical consequences, rather than reduced to generic lessons. That is especially important here because the argument of regime change emerges cumulatively from the episodes Haberman and Swan report. The big idea of the book. The central argument of regime change can be expressed simply. Donald Trump did not merely return to the presidency. He returned to a presidency that had been redesigned around Donald Trump. The decisive event, in Haberman and Swan's interpretation, was therefore not only Trump winning the 2024 election, it was losing the 2020 election. The 4 years between his presidencies allowed Trump and the movement around him to study everything that had frustrated his first administration. Officials who had resisted him could be excluded. Potential appointees could be screened for hostile comments. Legal strategies could be prepared in advance. Loyalists could gain experience. Groups outside government could develop personnel pipelines and policy plans. Trump himself returned knowing far more about the presidency than he had in January 2017. Haberman and Swan told Axios that two themes sat at the center of their book: Trump's willingness to use presidential power much more aggressively, and the effect of his 4 years outside government in intensifying his determination to project that power. This produces the book's most important paradox. Trump was defeated in 2020. Yet Haberman and Swan suggest that this defeat ultimately helped create a version of Trumpism capable of exercising considerably more power. A consecutive second Trump term beginning in January 2021 might have contained many of the same impulses, but not the same preparation, institutional knowledge, loyal personnel, or accumulated grievance. Kirkus highlights the same proposition from the book. The intervening years were central to the amount of authority Trump was able to accumulate on returning. Hence the title. Regime change normally describes one political order being displaced by another somewhere else in the world. Haberman and Swan deliberately apply the phrase to Washington. Their claim is not simply that America elected a Republican rather than a Democrat. They argue that the operating assumptions of the American presidency changed, the argument in one flow. Trump returns knowing where the breaks were. The simplest way to understand Trump's first administration is to picture an unusually powerful vehicle occupied by people repeatedly reaching for the handbrake. Trump could issue instructions, but instructions did not automatically become reality. Cabinet secretaries resisted. Government lawyers objected. Military leaders challenged proposals. Civil servants slowed implementation. Republican legislators had their own independent political identities. Senior advisors sometimes considered themselves custodians of institutions rather than servants of one individual president. Trump found this infuriating. The personnel surrounding his second presidency reflected the lesson. The question was increasingly not merely whether an official supported conservative policy. It was whether that official could be relied upon when Trump's wishes collided with conventional institutional thinking. Transition personnel reportedly examined prospective officials' previous social media statements for criticism of Trump, including what they had said following January 6th. That changes the character of government before a policy decision is even made. Traditional administrations contain internal ideological variation because presidents need expertise, coalition management, and institutional credibility. Trump's second operation placed extraordinary value on alignment. A government that screens heavily for loyalty will naturally generate fewer internal veto points. The people most likely to challenge the leader are filtered out before they reach the room. That is one of the book's most consequential insights. Authoritarian tendencies need not begin with someone formally abolishing institutions. They can develop through personnel. Replace independent actors with aligned ones, and the same institutional diagram can behave very differently. Stephen Miller represents the institutional memory of Trumpism. Stephen Miller becomes crucial to this story because he embodies continuity. Trump is intuitive. Miller is programmatic. Trump remembers grievances. Miller remembers mechanisms during the years outside power. Miller and other veterans of the first administration had time to understand where their previous immigration program had encountered legal, bureaucratic, and organizational resistance. Forbes' examination of regime change describes Miller as controlling the administration's immigration apparatus and highlights the importance of those 4 years in allowing him to study first-term failures and prepare a far more ambitious second-term program. This distinction between Trump and Miller matters. Trump supplies political energy and permission. Miller converts that energy into administrative action. In discussions of Trumpism, attention naturally gravitates towards Trump's personality. Regime change keeps revealing that personality is only part of the story. A movement becomes considerably more powerful once instinct develops institutional memory. Miller understands that executive power operates through staffing, legal interpretation, bureaucratic command structures, and relentless implementation. The administration, therefore, begins moving quickly on immigration almost immediately. That speed is deliberate. The objective is partly policy. But speed also creates political psychology. Opponents struggle to respond to one action before another arrives. News organizations cannot maintain public attention on every controversy. Government agencies are forced into constant adaptation. Courts move more slowly than political announcements. The cumulative result becomes what political strategists sometimes describe as flooding the zone. The whirlwind is a governing method. One of the most illuminating retrospective comments from Haberman concerns how different forces combined during the administration's opening period. Stephen Miller was driving an extremely organized immigration agenda. At the same moment, Elon Musk and Doge were generating a much less orderly attack on the federal bureaucracy. Haberman later described Musk as taking a metaphorical mallet to government, while acknowledging that Doge sometimes identified genuine duplication. Her larger point was that its activity generated enormous destabilization and fell far short of some of its promised savings. That combination is fascinating. One branch of Trumpism is highly organized. Another is deliberately disruptive. Yet they can reinforce one another. Miller wants specific outcomes. Musk wants radical institutional reduction. Trump likes visible action. The public sees government changing faster than conventional Washington politics usually permits. For a movement whose supporters believe the federal state has become an entrenched, hostile bureaucracy, destruction itself can become evidence of success. That is why the Doge story in regime change matters beyond Musk. Musk briefly occupied an extraordinary position in Trump's orbit. His wealth, public profile, control of X, political investment in Trump, and willingness to challenge government structures gave him influence unusual even by the standards of presidential advisors. Haberman later characterized his role as so destabilizing that the administration never fully recovered from the period in which Musk appeared almost like a co-president. Yet personal power near Trump is rarely secure. The alliance deteriorates. One of the reported turning points involved an Office of Personnel Management email asking federal workers to provide a list of what they had accomplished during the previous week. The Washington Post, summarizing revelations from the book, reports that the episode contributed to the widening fissure between Musk and the administration. This establishes another recurring law of Trump's political system. Loyalty gives access. Visibility gives influence. But nobody is allowed permanently to rival the center. Trump can empower enormous personalities precisely because he believes the ultimate authority remains his. Once that relationship becomes competitive, the arrangement becomes unstable. The presidency becomes more personal. Presidents always personalize power to some extent. Every administration reflects the temperament of the person occupying the Oval Office. Regime change depicts something more extensive. Trump's preferences begin operating almost as an alternative administrative logic. Appearance matters. Television matters. Personal chemistry matters. Flattery matters. Status matters. The emotional experience of a meeting can matter as much as an institutional briefing. Kirkus notes an episode in which Trump reportedly praised a prospective CIA leader as being like someone from Central Casting. The phrase captures an important dimension of Trump's political perception. He has spent much of his life in businesses where presentation matters: property, branding, entertainment, television, and celebrity. He frequently evaluates politicians as performers. Does someone look convincing in the role? Can they defend him on television? Do they project strength? Do they understand the audience? Traditional Washington culture prizes credentials and institutional experience. Trump often prizes recognizability and performance. That does not mean every appointment is based primarily on television suitability. It means that politics and performance become unusually intertwined. The information bubble tightens. The president's information environment forms another major strand. Haberman and Swan portray a Trump increasingly surrounded by people who understand which information he likes receiving and how he wants it presented. The danger of any powerful leader's information bubble is obvious. The stronger the leader becomes, the greater the incentive for subordinates to supply information that reinforces his assumptions. Bad news becomes professionally dangerous. Flattery becomes useful. Contradiction becomes costly. Kirkus summarizes the author's depiction of Trump living inside a bubble, moving between his private clubs and the White House, and being shown disproportionately positive information. This is one place where regime change becomes broader than a Trump book. Every hierarchy has this problem. The more powerful somebody becomes, the harder it can become for them to discover what is actually happening. People learn the boss. They learn which facts produce anger. They learn which arguments fail. They learn whose advice the boss respects. They edit themselves accordingly. A formally powerful leader can therefore become informationally weaker. Ukraine shows politics becoming performance. One of the book's most recognizable international episodes is Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance's extraordinary confrontation with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in the Oval Office. The public saw much of the encounter. The importance of Haberman and Swan's treatment is the political culture surrounding it. Kirkus reports that Trump subsequently compared the spectacle favorably with The Apprentice. That detail is more revealing than another 1,000 words describing Trump as unconventional. For most presidents, a diplomatic confrontation is evaluated primarily through strategy. What did the United States gain? What concessions were obtained? How were allies affected? What changed on the battlefield? Trump also evaluates politics through drama. Who dominated? Who looked weak? Who controlled the room? Who created the memorable television moment? That changes foreign policy because public humiliation can itself become a political asset. The encounter with Zelensky is therefore not merely an argument about Ukraine. It illustrates the merging of statecraft and spectacle. J.D. Vance is powerful, but not independent of Trump. Vance occupies a fascinating position inside the book. He is vice president, ideological interpreter, aggressive public advocate, and possible heir to the movement. Yet closeness to Trump does not mean equality. Kirkus notes episodes in which Trump treats Vance dismissively and raises the possibility that Marco Rubio could emerge as another important contender for Trump's political inheritance. That uncertainty matters. Trumpism has developed an enormous political ecosystem, but personal succession remains unresolved. A normal political ideology can outlive its leader because authority exists separately from the founder. A highly personalized movement faces a different problem. Who inherits legitimacy? Vance can articulate Trumpism intellectually. Rubio can display executive competence and international credibility. Others can inherit portions of the coalition. But none automatically inherits Trump. That tension sits beneath the second presidency even while Trump appears extraordinarily dominant. Elon Musk demonstrates the limits of shared power. If Vance shows the problem of succession, Musk shows the problem of parallel power. Trump welcomes strong personalities when their strength is useful to him. Musk offered technological prestige, money, a major communications platform, and an almost missionary commitment to attacking bureaucracy. For a time, their alliance was extraordinarily productive politically. Yet, regime change traces the consequences of allowing somebody else to become too large a character in an administration centered around one dominant personality. Musk's Doge operation rapidly became one of the defining images of the new government. That also meant Musk began receiving credit and blame independently of Trump. Once Musk becomes a political story in his own right, the internal geometry changes. The relationship eventually breaks down. The deeper lesson is not merely that Trump and Musk have volatile personalities. It is that personalist systems dislike competing centers of gravity. Retribution moves from rhetoric towards government. Trump returned to office believing he had been persecuted. That belief cannot be separated from the administration's behavior. He experienced investigations, impeachments, criminal prosecutions, civil litigation, and an unprecedented political comeback. Whether a reader views those legal proceedings as legitimate accountability, political weaponization, or some combination, is a separate argument. What matters for understanding Trump is that he regards them as components of a sustained campaign against him. That perception produces a powerful governing motive: retribution. The Washington Post's account of regime change identifies retaliation against perceived enemies as one of the central themes running through the book. Trump does not interpret many institutional conflicts impersonally. They involve people. People supported him or opposed him. People defended him or betrayed him. People pursued him or protected him. The presidency, therefore, becomes a mechanism through which old battles can continue. This is another way the intervening 4 years matter. Trump did not spend them forgetting his grievances. He returned with them enlarged. Epstein reveals the limits of message control. The Jeffrey Epstein controversy becomes one of the book's most extraordinary internal stories, because it exposes a vulnerability the administration cannot easily overpower. Trump's political movement had spent years fostering public suspicion of elite secrecy. The Epstein case sat perfectly inside that worldview. Many supporters expected dramatic disclosure. When those expectations collided with the realities facing the administration, the issue became politically dangerous. Haberman and Swan report that senior officials held meetings inside the White House Situation Room to discuss the response. The symbolism is almost absurd. The facility associated with wars, terrorist attacks, and national security emergencies becomes the venue for managing a political communications disaster. According to reporting around the book, Vice President Vance, Chief of Staff Susie Wiles, and other senior officials took part in discussions there. Why use such a secure location? One reason appears to have been fear of leaks. The administration had become exceptionally disciplined compared with Trump's first presidency, making Haberman and Swan's detailed reconstruction all the more remarkable. After excerpts appeared, some White House officials reportedly became so concerned about the precision of the dialogue that they wondered whether Situation Room conversations had somehow been recorded. Axios noted that officials did not dispute the substance of the reported conversations. The authors declined to discuss sourcing. The political importance goes further. Internal polling and focus group material obtained by Haberman and Swan reportedly showed voters raising Epstein without prompting, suggesting that the controversy had penetrated Trump's own coalition. Haberman argued that this was one of the moments when Trump began losing political altitude among sections of his base. That is crucial. Trump is exceptionally effective when confronting external enemies. Epstein was harder because the pressure came partly from people already inclined to support him. Attack Democrats? That strengthens partisan alignment. Attack the media? His supporters already distrusted. Attack prosecutors? Many supporters accept his account of political persecution. But when loyal supporters themselves demand answers, the normal defense mechanisms become less effective. Iran becomes the ultimate test of instinctive power. The most consequential expression of the book's thesis arrives in foreign policy. Trump has long presented himself as skeptical of prolonged Middle Eastern wars. Large sections of MAGA grew from the belief that America's foreign policy establishment repeatedly dragged the country into expensive conflicts without clear strategic benefit. Yet regime change follows Trump towards an extraordinarily consequential confrontation with Iran. Haberman has subsequently said that Trump disregarded warnings from several advisors before proceeding with military action, after Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu argued that regime change could be achieved. This episode crystallizes the central tension of the book. An unconstrained president can move faster. Sometimes that is an advantage. Bureaucracies genuinely can become timid. Consensus can produce paralysis. Expert communities can repeat stale assumptions. A leader willing to take risks can create outcomes cautious officials believed impossible. But the same system also concentrates the consequences of error. If dissent becomes weaker and instinct becomes stronger, the quality of the leader's instincts becomes a matter of enormous national importance. There is less institutional insurance. The president becomes both the accelerator and the risk model. That is why the subtitle, Inside the Imperial Presidency of Donald Trump, matters. Haberman and Swan are not claiming Trump has literally become an emperor. They are describing a presidency increasingly organized around personal discretion. Foreign policy becomes an extension of presidential psychology. This helps explain why the book's foreign policy sections are so important. Trump does not approach every country through a stable ideological framework. He is transactional. Personal relationships matter. Perceived respect matters. A leader's willingness to flatter him matters. Deals matter. Strength matters. Public embarrassment matters. The framework can be flexible in ways conventional foreign policy doctrine cannot. Trump can reverse direction rapidly because he feels less obligation to ideological consistency. That produces opportunities. It also creates uncertainty. Allies and adversaries must calculate not only American interests, but Trump's reactions. The United States remains an institutional superpower, but decision-making becomes more tightly linked to one individual's judgment. Congress matters less because Republicans need Trump more. The expansion of executive power is not simply something Trump does to Congress. Congress participates in the process by failing to constrain him. The Republican Party changed enormously between 2017 and Trump's return. During his first term, influential Republicans could imagine a future beyond Trump. Some opposed him publicly. Others supported his policies while resisting his behavior. By the second presidency, Trump had become the dominant organizing force of Republican politics. Primary voters remained loyal to him. His endorsements mattered. Politicians who crossed him could face career-threatening consequences. Congressional independence therefore carried higher political costs. This transforms checks and balances without requiring anybody to rewrite the Constitution. A formal power can remain intact while the willingness to exercise it disappears. That is one of the deepest implications of regime change. Institutions are not self-executing. They depend on human beings choosing to use them. The lawyers have changed too. Trump's first presidency frequently encountered lawyers whose instinct was to explain what he could not do. The second administration contains more lawyers focused on determining how far presidential power can be stretched. That is a profound change in orientation. One legal culture asks, "Is this traditionally permitted?" Another asks, "What is the most aggressive, defensible interpretation that lets us proceed?" The difference can reshape the presidency without any constitutional amendment. Haberman and Swan's narrative repeatedly returns to the reduced capacity of internal actors to stop decisions before they are made. There are still disagreements. There are still advisors who warn Trump. There are still courts. There are still bureaucracies. There are still elections. The argument is not that every restraint vanished. The argument is that the presidency has become structurally more capable of converting Trump's preferences into action. Even success creates new risks. One of Trump's most distinctive psychological characteristics in regime change is his belief that survival validates judgment. He survived scandals that would have destroyed ordinary politicians. He survived impeachment. Twice. He survived criminal prosecution. He survived an assassination attempt. He returned after losing an election. Then he won again. Imagine the lessons such a sequence might teach the person experiencing it. Not caution. Confirmation. Repeated survival can teach somebody that conventional warnings are wrong. Experts said something was too dangerous. He survived. Critics said a scandal would finish him. He survived. Republicans said he could not win. He survived. Prosecutors tried to convict him. He survived politically. Opponents predicted electoral rejection. He returned to power. From Trump's perspective, the evidence of his own life repeatedly tells him that doubters underestimate him. That makes restraint psychologically harder. The most important ideas inside the argument. 1. Trump 2 was built during the Biden presidency. The most important period in the second Trump administration may have occurred before it began. 4 years outside power-produced planning. Potential appointees were identified. Legal obstacles were studied. First-term mistakes were analyzed. Loyalty networks strengthened. Policy entrepreneurs prepared. Trump developed an even deeper sense that federal institutions had been used against him. His comeback, therefore, fused competence with grievance. That combination is much more consequential than either quality alone. 2. Loyalty changes the information reaching a leader. People often analyze loyalty as a moral question. Regime change reveals its operational consequences. A government of loyalists is not merely friendlier to the president. It supplies different information. Dissent arrives differently. Bad news is packaged differently. Risk becomes harder to communicate. Officials anticipate the president's desires before receiving explicit instructions. That can dramatically increase the leader's practical power. 3. Trump understands power as something valuable only when used. Presidential authority is not primarily ceremonial in Trump's worldview. Power exists to achieve outcomes. He distrusts restraints that appear self-imposed. Haberman and Swan have described this greater willingness to exercise power as one of the book's central themes. That instinct helps explain why conventional warnings often fail. An advisor can tell Trump that no previous president has done something. Trump may hear that not as a warning, but as an opportunity. 4. Political theater is part of governance. Television logic remains embedded in Trump's presidency. Politics generates characters. Meetings generate confrontations. Negotiations generate winners and losers. Moments are evaluated partly according to their dramatic impact. This helps Trump dominate attention. It can also distort decision-making when political spectacle becomes evidence of substantive success. 5%. The system can be stronger and more fragile simultaneously. This is perhaps the most interesting contradiction. Trump's second administration is stronger internally because fewer people can obstruct him. Yet that very strength creates vulnerability. A system dependent on one person's judgment can become extraordinarily efficient when that judgment is correct and extraordinarily exposed when it is wrong. Power eliminates friction. Friction sometimes prevented mistakes. The strongest chapter or section. The book's strongest material is arguably not one isolated chapter, but the interconnected reporting around the Situation Room. There, the abstraction of Imperial presidency becomes physical. Senior officials discuss Epstein inside one of America's most secure national security facilities. The administration debates enormous geopolitical decisions around Iran. The conversations reconstructed by Haberman and Swan show cabinet officials disagreeing, warning, persuading, and attempting to interpret what Trump wants. The effect is remarkable because the reader sees how power actually operates. Policies that later appear inevitable were not inevitable inside the room. People argued. Alternatives existed. Individuals tried to shape Trump. Sometimes he listened. Sometimes he did not. That distinction prevents the book becoming a cartoon version of dictatorship in which everyone merely obeys. Trump's system remains political. The difference is that the decisive gravitational force is increasingly Trump himself. The weakest chapter or section. The book's greatest strength creates its main weakness. Haberman and Swan possess extraordinary access to elite conversations. That inevitably means Washington elites dominate the story. The reader spends enormous amounts of time with presidents, billionaires, cabinet officials, political strategists, lawyers, and senior advisors. The ordinary people affected by immigration enforcement, government restructuring, tariffs, wars, or administrative disruption receive comparatively less narrative space. This is not a reporting failure so much as a consequence of the book's chosen lens. Regime change asks how presidential power operates from the inside. It is less interested in constructing a bottom-up social history of the second Trump presidency. Readers should therefore resist confusing an excellent account of elite decision-making with a total account of America during the period. What the book proves. It convincingly demonstrates that Trump's second administration is organizationally different from his first. It demonstrates that the intervening 4 years materially changed the personnel, planning, and governing philosophy surrounding him. It demonstrates that loyalty has become an unusually important qualification for access to presidential power. It demonstrates that Trump is significantly more familiar with the mechanisms of government than he was in 2017. It demonstrates that senior advisors frequently have to navigate presidential instinct, rather than merely present conventional policy options. It demonstrates that internal decision-making can be far more contentious than polished public announcements suggest. And it demonstrates the extraordinary degree to which Trump himself remains the organizing personality of the administration. What the book does not prove. The phrase imperial presidency should not be mistaken for proof that constitutional government has ceased to function. Courts still matter. Congress still possesses formal powers. State governments remain powerful. Elections remain decisive. Media organizations continue exposing information the White House would prefer to keep private. The existence of this book is itself evidence of that. Nor does regime change prove that every unconventional use of executive authority is automatically unlawful or unsuccessful. Readers hostile to Trump can make the mistake of treating norm-breaking and illegality as synonyms. They are not. A president can behave in unprecedented ways while remaining within legal authority. Conversely, long-standing political practice does not automatically make conduct constitutional. Those distinctions matter. What most summaries miss. The obvious interpretation of regime change is that Trump became more powerful. The better interpretation is that the people around Trump became better at making Trump powerful. That difference changes everything. Personal leadership alone cannot transform a federal government containing millions of employees. You need personnel systems, legal theories, agency leadership, administrative instructions, political discipline, congressional acquiescence, communications infrastructure, movement organizations, money, policy preparation. Trump's second presidency is therefore simultaneously more personal and more institutionalized. That apparent contradiction is the book's deepest insight. Trumpism becomes stronger when it stops depending solely on Trump improvising, what most people misunderstand. A simplistic reading says the second administration contains nobody willing to disagree with Trump. That is not what the reporting shows. Officials do argue. Rubio has views. Vance has views. Bessent has views. Wiles manages. Hegseth advocates. Miller pushes. Musk pushes. Netanyahu attempts to persuade from outside. The difference is where final authority sits. Trump does not lack advisors. He lacks the type of independent internal restraints that sometimes defined his first administration. There is an enormous difference between someone who advises the president not to do something and someone who believes they possess an institutional responsibility to prevent him from doing it. The first is counsel. The second is constraint. The second category has dramatically weakened. The dangerous misreading. The dangerous pro-Trump reading would be, Trump removed the bureaucrats, therefore removing constraints is inherently good. The dangerous anti-Trump reading would be, Trump exercises enormous authority, therefore every exercise of that authority must be illegitimate. Both avoid the harder question. A democracy needs an executive capable of acting. It also needs mechanisms that make catastrophic mistakes difficult. Too much friction produces paralysis. Too little friction produces volatility. The problem posed by regime change is not whether presidents should possess power. They obviously must. The question is, how much depends on the judgment of one individual before the system becomes dangerously brittle? The tailored interpretation. The most revealing way to read regime change is as a book about friction. Trump spent his first presidency discovering friction. People delayed him. Institutions resisted him. Republicans challenged him. Lawyers objected. Advisors leaked. Officials resigned. Courts intervened. The bureaucracy absorbed instructions slowly. Trump experienced friction as betrayal. Most institutional designers would describe at least some of that friction as protection. The 4 years outside power allowed Trumpism to conduct an enormous friction audit. Where had presidential instructions stopped? Who stopped them? Which officials mattered? Which laws mattered? Which norms mattered? Which organizations needed alternative staffing? Where were lawsuits likely? How could authority be centralized? Once you see the book this way, the second presidency becomes easier to understand. Trump, too, is not simply Trump with greater confidence. It is Trump with fewer intermediaries between desire and action. That can create spectacular political effectiveness. It can also create spectacular strategic risk. The defining question is no longer whether someone can stop Trump from doing something increasingly, it is whether Trump himself decides not to do it. Why this book still matters. Regime Change was published on June 23, 2026, while the presidency it describes was still unfolding. The publisher lists it as a 496-page account of the second Trump administration, and contemporary reviews emphasized that it functions as real-time political history, rather than a retrospective written after records had been opened. That creates an obvious limitation. The ending of the Trump presidency is not available to the authors. Decisions they describe as historically important may later prove temporary. Officials who look dominant may disappear. Policies may be overturned. Court rulings may redraw the limits of executive authority. Election results may change congressional incentives. International events may transform judgments about foreign policy decisions. Indeed, current events already extend beyond the period reconstructed in the book, particularly around Iran. Those later developments should not be backdated into Haberman and Swan's narrative. But that is also why the book matters. It captures decisions before history cleans them up. Retrospective memoirs create coherence. Participants forget uncertainty. Successful decisions become inevitable. Failures become somebody else's responsibility. Early doubts disappear. Regime change preserves the mess. If you only remember 3 ideas. 1. Losing power helped Trump learn how to use it. Trump's absence between 2021 and 2025 was not dead time. It allowed his movement to study the first administration, prepare personnel and policies, refine legal strategies, and deepen its hostility towards institutions seen as obstructive. That preparation may have made the second Trump presidency more consequential than an uninterrupted second term would have been. 2. Personnel determine the real limits of presidential power. Written constitutional powers tell only part of the story. The practical question is who receives the instruction. A skeptical attorney general, resistant general, independent congressional leader, or cautious White House counsel can create friction. Replace them with officials who interpret their mandate primarily as implementing the president's agenda, and the practical presidency expands dramatically without changing a single word of the Constitution. 3. Removing constraints transfers risk to the leader. An unconstrained executive can act decisively. It can also make enormous mistakes decisively. The more personalized the system becomes, the more national outcomes depend upon the quality of one person's judgment, emotional discipline, and access to accurate information. That is the bargain running through the entire book. The sentence that explains the book. Trump's second presidency is what happens when a leader who always wanted fewer restraints returns to power, surrounded by people who spent 4 years learning how to remove them. The real-life test. The lesson extends well beyond politics. Imagine running a company. You inherit a management team that challenges your decisions. They delay projects. They demand evidence. They sometimes refuse proposals. That is frustrating. So you replace them with people who move quickly, share your worldview, and rarely question your judgment. Performance initially improves. Projects launch faster. Meetings shorten. Internal conflict falls. You feel vindicated. Then you make one terrible decision. Nobody challenges it. That is the regime change problem. Good leaders need authority. They also need high-quality resistance. The objective is not to surround yourself with people who oppose everything, nor is it to surround yourself with people who approve everything. The strongest system creates productive friction. Advisors loyal enough to execute decisions, but independent enough to say when the evidence is wrong. Once loyalty becomes confused with agreement, information quality deteriorates. And once the leader stops hearing bad information, apparently greater control can become less control over reality. 5 questions to test whether you understood the book. Why was Trump's 2020 defeat important to his second presidency? Because the 4-year interruption gave Trump and his allies time to analyze the first administration's failures, construct personnel networks, prepare policies, develop legal strategies, and strengthen a worldview built around institutional betrayal. 2. Why is Stephen Miller more important than a conventional political advisor? Because he represents institutional memory. Trump supplies political instinct and authority. Miller understands how to convert priorities, particularly on immigration, into sustained administrative machinery. 3. What does Elon Musk's rise and fall reveal? That Trump can grant extraordinary influence to powerful allies when they advance his objectives, but parallel centers of political authority become unstable inside a system ultimately organized around Trump. 4. Why is the Epstein episode so revealing? Because it created pressure from within Trump's own political coalition and forced senior officials into an unusual defensive posture. The Situation Room meetings also exposed the administration's intense concern about controlling sensitive political information. 5. What does Imperial Presidency mean in the book? Not that America formally became an empire or dictatorship, but that presidential authority became increasingly personalized and expansive as institutional, political, and personnel restraints weakened. The final lesson. The most unsettling conclusion of regime change is not that Donald Trump changed. Trump remains recognizably Trump. The appetite for attention is familiar. The sensitivity to loyalty is familiar. The instinctive decision-making is familiar. The fascination with strength is familiar. The hostility towards perceived enemies is familiar. The confidence in his own judgment is familiar. What changed was the environment surrounding those characteristics. In 2017, Trump entered Washington as an outsider who possessed presidential authority without fully understanding the enormous machine attached to it. He depended on Republicans whose careers predated him. He inherited institutional assumptions he did not share. He appointed people he later considered disloyal. He encountered officials who believed restraint was part of their duty. He discovered that issuing an instruction did not guarantee its implementation. Then he lost power. 4 years later, he returned carrying the memory of every obstruction. His movement returned carrying the blueprint. That is why Haberman and Swan call what followed regime change. The transformation was not simply ideological. It was operational. The political system around Trump learned Trump. It learned what he wanted. It learned what had stopped him. It learned which people he trusted. It learned how quickly opposition could organize. It learned how courts might react. It learned the importance of staffing. And it learned that one of the fastest ways to expand presidential authority was not necessarily to obtain new formal powers. It was to remove the people unwilling to use the existing ones as Trump wanted. That leaves America with the central question regime change cannot answer, because history has not answered it yet. What happens when the president decides there is no reason to stop himself?